All the way back in 2017, Panasonic released the GH5, and it was a massive success. Today, we are checking out the long-awaited GH6. But was it worth the wait? Do Micro Four Thirds cameras still have their place in 2022? And is it the camera for you? Let's take a look. So much has changed in our industry over the past few years, and it's safe to say that larger sensor size video cameras have been a strong trend over that time, with camera manufacturers focusing on bringing out cameras with these larger size sensors. Electronics in general have also gotten a lot more expensive, and camera equipment has seen some pretty big price increases. For example, if we take a look at the Sony a7S II at release, that cost £2,050. Whereas the a7S III, even a year after release, will still set you back almost double at £3,799. Panasonic introduced the GH5 all the way back in 2017 for £1,699 for the body only, and it's great to see that the GH6 hasn't gone up in price much, as it has a retail price of £1,999 for body only. I would have loved it to stay at the same price as the GH5, but we are living in a different world now, and it's still quite well priced considering all of these factors. At this new price point though, it does have some pretty stiff competition. You have Panasonic's own S5, Blackmagic's Pocket 4K, 6K and 6K Pro, Secam's E2 M4, Canon's R6 and the Sony a7 IV, all of which have different sensor sizes, pros, cons and prices. With all of these cameras to compare the GH6 to, I think the bigger question is, does Micro Four Thirds still have its place 5 years after the GH5 release? Even in 2022, there are still plenty of reasons why you should be considering a Micro Four Thirds camera, as they do have their pros over APS-C and full frame cameras. More often than not, they offer a good value in comparison to larger sensor cameras with comparable features. When compared to cameras with larger sensors, they are normally smaller and lighter. However, I think this isn't quite as true as it used to be. On average, the lenses designed for Micro Four Thirds can be smaller, lighter, and more affordable than lenses designed for larger formats. However, there are plenty of options that will cost the same as glass made for larger sensors as well, and plenty of larger format lenses that are cheaper than some MFT options. With a smaller sensor size, you are able to achieve a deeper depth of field than with larger sensors at the same field of view and equivalent f-stop. This is something that some shooters may want for their work, such as for run and gun documentaries. You will also be able to achieve tighter field of views, aka longer zooms, because of the size of the sensor. As with loads of mirrorless cameras now, the short flange that MFT cameras offer, paired with the smaller sensor, means you have an incredible amount of lenses to choose from, all the way from vintage to full frame glass. You also have the ability to use focal reducers to achieve a larger sensor look and gain an extra stop of light in the process. If you want to learn more about how these work, check out our video covering it in the description below. There are also some downsides of MFT though, which mainly stem from the size of the sensor. Due to the smaller sensor size and how they are designed, there will be a limit to how good the low light performance and dynamic range will be compared to larger sensors. The full frame look has become more and more popular over the years, and one of the biggest elements of this is being able to achieve wider field of views with a shallower depth of field, which is difficult to achieve on MFT without the use of a focal reducer. For our creative tests, we spent the day down in Horsham shooting at a local park for some outside shots, and we then headed back to Joe's to film him cooking some cracking beef ragu. For the interior shots, we used a 600D Pro as our main light, firing through a window to create some nice shadows, as well as to fill the room up with some light. We then used a couple of Quasar tube lights, as well as an Aperture LS60X for different setups as we shot. Here's a quick cut of our favourite shots from the day. If you've used any modern Panasonic camera before, then you'll feel at home on the GH6 when you're using it. The camera didn't skip a beat during the shoot in Joe's hot kitchen, and we managed to get some nice shots. I do think it looks a touch noisy straight out of camera with no noise reduction, but with some noise reduction in Resolve, the footage cleans up nicely. We exposed using a mix of zebras and the built-in waveform. Our zebras were set to 85% plus, so that we can then expose to the first clip point in our scene and then reduce our exposure a little bit until that overexposure area is back in our dynamic range. Let us know what you think of the image that this camera can produce in the comments below. We shot all of our BTS on the S1H, and I forgot just how good the image out of this camera is. The GH6 features a new 25.2 megapixel sensor with a width of 17.3mm and a height of 13mm. It has a maximum usable resolution of 5769 by 4320 in its 4:3 anamorphic mode. The new processor found in the GH6 is twice as fast as the modern cameras in the GH or S series line. The GH6 comes with Panasonic's full Vlog pre-installed, and this means that when combined with the new sensor and processing, the GH6 can in theory capture up to 13 stops of dynamic range. But this is actually not a simple thing because of the new dynamic range boost mode that the GH6 features. The camera's native ISO will depend on what gamma you are in, as well as whether you have the dynamic range boost mode on or off, and you can see them on screen here. This new dynamic range boost mode in the GH6 has been designed to do exactly what it says, increase the dynamic range possible with an MFT sensor. Panasonic has said that they are achieving this by combining two different circuits on the sensor, a low and high circuit for each pixel, which the camera then combines to improve the dynamic range of the image. This sounds very similar to the systems found in the Canon C70, C300 Mark III and the Arri Alexa. The official dynamic range numbers from Panasonic are that the camera can capture 12 plus in its regular mode and then 13 plus in this boost mode. This new mode will work up to 60 frames per second across any format you'd like to choose, but will not be possible in the higher frame rate modes. When in this mode, the camera will grey out some formats that are not possible when in this mode in the recording quality menu. This feature is off by default in the menu, and you can even assign it to one of the many custom function buttons in case you want to switch quickly on the fly. You can turn this mode on no matter what colour profile you want to use as well, whether that's a 709 profile or Vlog or HLG. As we can see from this chart, the base ISOs in this mode are quite high, especially the 2000 Vlog and HLG. This is a bit of a shame, as if you want to shoot in Vlog, which lots of people will want to, it means you will 100% have to have a strong ND system on the front to deal with the extra sensitivity to light that this camera has over some of its predecessors and competition. 2000 ISO is very high for if you're outside in broad daylight. You're going to seriously need some strong ND for this. This high ISO can be avoided though if you switch to any of the other profiles in the camera, such as like 709, which will allow you to go down to ISO 800 if you need to for exposure's sake. Compared to Panasonic's existing line of cameras, the GH6's native ISO definitely sits way above the rest in this mode, and it's a shame the camera doesn't have a second base. However, this feature has been removed in favour of the new dynamic range boost mode. When Canon introduced a similar feature with the C300 Mark III and then the C70, people loved it, and I think this will be the case here as well. But this could be at the cost of good low light performance, but we'll have a little look at that later on in the video. I think it would have been really good if Panasonic could have somehow made it possible to have a dual base in the regular mode and then obviously the single one in the boost mode, where if you want more dynamic range you can just hop into that mode. If we look at this chart that Panasonic has provided, we can see that when shooting in Vlog, the GH6 in its dynamic range boost mode is rated for 5 plus stops above 18% grey and 4 plus when this is turned off. So the extra stop it is providing is in the highlights, which is good. Let's check out our Latitude tests and examine this new mode some more. For our Latitude tests, we compared the GH6 to a few of its competitors. We used our trusty Otis 55mm f1.4 across all of the cameras. Each camera was shot at its own lowest native ISO, and we used each camera's best exposure tool to expose mid-grey on our chart to the correct IRE values needed. To deal with the difference in ISO, we used shutter to compensate. For the under test, the scene was lit for f2, and then we stopped down to 6 stops underexposed. And for the over test, we lit the scene for f16 and then opened up our lens a stop at a time until we hit 4 stops over, where we then did third stop increments until we hit 6 stops over. We thought we would include the extra third stop increments as it will allow us to see performance more precisely between the cameras. During our Latitude tests, I wanted to shoot them with the camera's dynamic range boost mode toggled on and off to visually see the difference between the two modes. If we compare them at the same stops, the underexposure modes look pretty close, but I would say the footage of the boost mode on does look a touch cleaner. When it comes to overexposure, it's a much more obvious difference that starts being apparent from 3 stops over. This isn't surprising given the extra stop this mode is giving you. So long story short, if you want the most latitude possible, shoot vlog with the boost mode on. We've also uploaded all of these clips back to back on our Vimeo for better evaluation. Link to that is in the description below. The camera that Panasonic has sent us is a pre-production camera running early firmware, so things can still change. Anyway, we're going to let the rest of the results play out now. If you want to skip ahead, you can see the timecode for it on screen now. When it comes to noise reduction, as we mentioned, you can dial in the sharpness and noise reduction level in the photo style system for each profile. However, the camera does look to execute some noise reduction in camera as you step up the ISO range. When it comes to the noise profile of the GH6, we tested with the dynamic range boost mode toggled on and off. In the dynamic range boost mode in like 709, we can see a clear step of noise reduction at 3200 ISO, but in Vlog there is no noise reduction across the range. These port cap tests were shot with the colour profiles set to their defaults, which are 0 sharpness and 0 noise reduction in Vlog. When in the regular mode without boost turned on, we can see the same step but at slightly different ISOs, 2000 when in Vlog and 640 in like 709. We can tell this is noise reduction as the image looks mushier when compared to the base ISOs in each of these modes. When we compare the GH6 at ISO 250 with the boost mode off and ISO 2000 with the boost mode on, we can see that they are quite comparable, but the 2000 ISO in the boost mode does look a bit cleaner in the port cap shots. As you step up the ISO range towards 6400, they do look very comparable as well. When we compare the GH6 to the S5, we can see that the S5 looks much better at the higher ISOs. The noise looks much more natural and less chromatic, but this could partly be down to the increased compression that the S5 uses over the ProRes we use to record these tests on the GH6. Honestly though, this isn't surprising given the sensors each of these cameras uses. I do find that the GH6's noise profile at ISO 2000 in the boost mode to be a little bit chromer than I would have liked it to be. Just bear in mind that it does look like the GH6 footage is more detailed than the S5 in these tests, so you could easily apply some noise reduction in Resolve and get them to very similar places. When we compare the GH6 to the GH5 Mark II at each camera's lowest bases, we can see that it looks equally as clean. However, at 2000 with boost mode on, we can see the GH6's noise profile is much better. Port cap finding aside, how does it perform in low light? Well, with the GH6 featuring a higher resolution sensor than previous MFT cameras, and with more pixels crammed into an MFT sensor, it could mean that this sensor performs worse in low light. So we wanted to see how the GH6 compares to the S5 and GH5 II when it comes to low light performance, as the camera does feature a whole host of new noise reduction techniques that Panasonic have introduced with the camera. Long story short, it's not as good as the S5, but better than the GH5 Mark II. The S5's dual base ISO makes a big difference, so shooting at 6400 ISO plus on both cameras, you will see better performance on the S5. However, for an MFT camera, the GH6 does perform very well. I just wouldn't call it a no-light camera like some of its competition. The GH6 does not feature an OLPF, which means that we should expect some kind of artifacts on high detailed areas. And if we check out our chart here, we can see some moire in the center of frame in the highly detailed areas of our chart. If we look at the Full HD interlace modes, they exhibit far worse moire than the rest of the formats, which seem to look roughly the same. When it comes to rolling shutter performance, I wanted to compare the GH6 to the original GH5, and it looks pretty comparable. It's definitely not on par with the performance of the A7S Mark III, but it is comparable to existing MFT sensors. It's a shame that it's not quite as fast as it could be, given the new processing and the size of the sensor. I was hoping for better performance here. But if you've shot with any mirrorless cameras at all over the past few years, you'll be used to this level of performance, unless you're coming from an A7S III or a Komodo. The GH6 features a newly improved IBIS system, which is stated to provide up to 7.5 stops of image stabilization. Panasonic has had some of the best in-camera stabilization for a while now, and the GH6 does step it up another notch. When you combine lens stabilization, sensor, and some of the extra modes in the camera, it has some serious stabilization power. If you are using a native lens that has an OIS switch on it, this will turn all stabilization on and off with the camera. If the lens doesn't have a switch, you'll have to toggle sensor IS on and off in the menu. In here, there are also two key modes worth understanding. E-stabilization is a third level of stabilization on top of the sensor and the lens stabilization that crops in on the sensor to give you even more stabilization on top of the lens and sensor stabilization. Boost mode has been designed to emulate tripod shots, and panning or moving with this will introduce some weird movements, but it does a great job for locked off style shots. It's seriously impressive how good this system has now got, but of course it will not replace the need for proper stabilization equipment. It will just help you out when hand holding it in specific scenarios. These test shots were all shot with the Panasonic 12-60 f2.8 to f4 at roughly 18mm. When stepping through the different levels of IBIS in these tests, we can see a clear difference between no sensor IBIS and IBIS with the lens IS. Image stabilization is something that Panasonic really have got nailed down now, and it's really evident in the GH6. It just works really well and would be a very useful feature for many run and gun filmmakers. The GH6 has a range of photo styles or profiles that anyone who's shot with a Panasonic camera before will be familiar with. However, for most video users, really only a few worth exploring, like Cinelight D2, Cinelight V2, like 709, Vlog, HLG, and the custom profiles. It's great to have full Vlog instead of just Vlog L like previous iterations of the GH series. The 4 custom profiles are great for you to tweak any of the profiles in the camera and then save them as your own versions while keeping the stock profiles stock. Here's the same shot of Sam back to back using each color profile untweaked straight out of the camera. Over the years, people have debated what settings are best to achieve a solid 709 image straight out of Panasonic's cameras, and really this will come down to personal preference. So using these custom profiles will allow you to experiment with your camera and the profiles available to get the image as close to your preference. Personally, after some testing, I like the way we managed to get the Cinelight D2 profile looking with a few tweaks, which you can see on screen here. But the Like 709 profile can also get to a good place too with a few tweaks. It will just come down to what you want the image to look like. Giving end users loads of format and codec options is something that Panasonic have been great at over the years, and the GH6 continues that. You have a massive range to choose from no matter what you need. It can actually be a little bit daunting seeing all these options, so it's lucky that the GH6 does have the same format limit feature that the S1H introduced, so you can limit your options to only ones that you use regularly to find them faster. One of the biggest new additions to the GH6 is its ability to capture ProRes internally. ProRes is an industry standard format because of its fantastic NLE support, as well as its performance on less powerful systems. At release, the GH6 can capture 5.7K in either ProRes 42HQ as well as in 422 in a range of frame rates up to 30p. This will require the use of a CF Express Type B card that can handle the demanding sustained data rates that this requires. When shooting at 30p 42HQ, the data rate will be roughly 1903 megabits per second or 238 megabytes per second. This means a minute of recording is roughly 14.2 gigabytes. When shooting at 30p in 422, the data rate will be roughly 1268 megabits per second or 158 megabytes per second. And this means that a minute of recording is roughly 9.48 gigabytes. With this in mind, we can calculate that a 1TB CF Express card will last approximately 70 minutes when recording 42HQ, but this will depend on how much usable memory that card has. The most affordable 1TB Type B card on the market currently is the AV Pro Mark II from Angelbird, and that is roughly £469. So if you're planning on shooting a good amount of ProRes, media costs will add up really quickly, so this is something definitely worth keeping in mind when you're buying the camera. Panasonic has promised that in an upcoming firmware update, they will be adding DCI 4K and Full HD ProRes 42 and 42HQ to the internal recording options, which will be great additions. Fingers crossed the 4K is downscaled, as that would be far better to shoot in for most people than 5.7K due to the reduced data rates, and you'd also get the same image as downscaling a 5.7K clip in post, which means you'll get a great image still. As well as ProRes, the GH6 offers a range of other formats in different compressions and data rates. There's honestly so much to choose from. Here's a chart with all the MOV formats, pause if you want to check them all out, and here's a chart of all the MP4 formats. As the camera features a sensor with a higher resolution than it can record in, one of the key questions I asked Panasonic was how is the camera handling capturing that sensor in these lower resolution recording modes? Well, what the camera is doing depends on what frame rate you are in. In everything up to 120 frames per second, the camera is downscaling the image, which is what you would be doing in post if you captured in 5.7K and then put the footage onto a 4K or 1080p timeline. At frame rates above 120, Panasonic has implemented some kind of pixel binning or line skipping system, which will mean the image quality will drop. When it comes to slow motion and high frame rates, you have a large range of options on the GH6 in both 4K and Full HD. The max frame rate that you'll be able to go up to will depend on what mode you're in. You have your regular shooting mode, variable frame rate mode, and a high frame rate mode. You can switch between normal and high frame rates by switching between the different recording quality frame rates in the main menu here. Though just bear in mind you will need to conform your clips to whatever frame rate you would like to use in post with this option. To go into variable frame rate mode, you'll have to select formats that denote whether they allow for this mode while viewing their details in the recording quality menu here. You can then go down to variable frame rate and dial in your frame rate above or below your base frame rate. When in this mode, your clips will conform to the project frame rate that is stated here and will not record any sound. This is the mode to be in if you want to capture at the more extreme frame rates that this camera can capture. It does take some time to navigate around this menu a little bit, and it's a bit cumbersome to have to switch the format you need to be in and then come out into variable frame rate. But luckily you can load different setups into C1, 2 and 3 on the mode dial to switch faster between these different modes. The overall look of the slow motion is decent though. Of course, the lower resolution stuff doesn't look as good as the higher resolution stuff, but that's not surprising. It's pretty awesome to have all of these options in the camera though. In the GH6 you can shoot 5.7K up to 30p, 4K up to 120p, and Full HD up to 300 frames per second. When shooting these tests, we unfortunately ran into an artifact known as CMOS streaking or smearing. This is a pretty normal issue that CMOS sensors can suffer with in extreme scenarios like these tests. It occurs when you have a very bright highlight next to a dark part of the image and it looks like this. This isn't a flaw of the camera, but a flaw of CMOS sensors. However, some cameras are more sensitive to it than others. We've shot our high frame rate tests pretty consistently for a while now, and this is the first time we've noticed it during these tests. Luckily, when you sling a lot onto it, or transform it to 709, it's hard to see. I just thought it's worth mentioning in case anyone runs into it when shooting in vlog. We actually sent Panasonic examples of this smearing issue, and they managed to turn around a new firmware in 2 days that looks to have made a big difference in performance. Weirdly, this example with the revised firmware looked to still suffer from pretty bad smearing on the back of the camera when looking at vlog, but the footage itself looks really good, with very minimal streaking or smearing off of the fan blades. As we've come to expect from Panasonic, the GH6 features the ability to shoot anamorphic in a few different modes, as well as de-squeeze 2x, 1.8, 1.5, 1.33 and 1.3 anamorphic lenses. The two available formats are a 5.8K 4x3 mode, which can go up to 30p, as well as a 4.4K 4x3 mode, which can go up to 60p, with the latter cropping in on the sensor. Both of these are limited to only being recordable in 420 10-bit long op H.265, which is a bit of a shame given what the camera can capture in other modes. It would have been nice to have either a nice intro option or even better yet, a ProRes one. But it is great to have the option still with the GH6. I just wish we had some slightly better recording options. With the addition of several new recording formats and frame rates, as well as the increase in resolution, comes an increase in data rates. This means Panasonic had to update the recording media slightly to handle these increased data rates. On the GH6, we still have a dual card slot, but this now consists of a CF Express Type B slot and a UHS-2 rated SD card slot. For those who are not aware, the CF Express Type B is a new media type that is slowly being adopted by more and more cameras, such as the R5, R5C, C400 Mark III and C400 Mark II from Canon, as well as Red's V-Raptor. This is because of its high data throughput versus media such as CFast 2, which was limited by its SATA interface, whereas CF Express uses NVMe. There are some recording modes in the GH6 that are limited to only being able to record onto CF Express Type B, which we have listed here. Otherwise, you should be able to record everything else onto SD cards that can handle the data rates associated with whatever you are trying to record. As always, I would suggest buying the best media you can within your given budget, so you can record in these higher data rate modes without issues. The cost of this media is really worth considering though, as these new CF Express cards are expensive, and with the camera priced as it is, you could easily spend the same cost as the camera on media if you want to record in ProRes for an entire shooting day. Panasonic should be putting together a list of compatible media, link to that when I have it will be down in the description. The camera also features all of the same relay and dual recording modes as previous cameras in the Panasonic mirrorless line. The GH6 features a full-size HDMI 2.1 port, which will be capable of outputting 4K 120p. However, this is a feature that isn't in the camera yet, but will come later on down the line in new firmware with the ability to also output 4K 120p RAW, which you'll be able to capture with the Ninja 5 Plus. At release, there still are some good options if you would like to record externally. You are able to record a mixture of resolutions while also recording internally as well as just outputting, and this will depend on what mode you have the camera in. Luckily, you can use this chart here to see exactly what combinations you can do. Being able to record internally and externally is great if you require redundancy, which you'll need for something like capturing wedding speeches or live events for example. For those wanting to just grab a monitor instead of a recorder, Panasonic has worked with port keys to bring camera control to their BM5WR, BM5.3 and LH5P monitors. I won't go in depth with it here, but I have linked to Portkey's webpage which does via the description below. The GH5 did suffer from a slightly laggy HDMI port, which isn't uncommon with cameras that use HDMI, as HDMI will suffer from latency issues compared to an SDI output. So we wanted to capture the GH6 and see what kind of delay the HDMI has. For this, we set up our red Komodo to capture the whole scene, pointed our GH6 at a phone stopwatch, and connected our GH6 to our Ninja 5 via HDMI. We can then hit record on the Komodo and then bring this footage into post and see the delay. We tested this while outputting both 4K and 1080p via the HDMI while the camera was in its ProRes 5.7K mode. The iPhone stopwatch uses centiseconds, so we'll need to convert to milliseconds as this is used more when discussing delay. We can see that there is roughly 50 to 100 milliseconds of delay on the back of the monitor of the GH6, and then roughly 200 to 240 milliseconds delay on our HDMI monitor. This is quite a substantial amount of delay on the HDMI, but not super uncommon, as like I said, HDMI does have issues with latency. All we have to do is compare it to the latency of these examples from our wireless video of a C300 Mark III connected to a Teradect via SDI. Even the Cine 7 receiving the image wirelessly has less latency than the HDMI example we have set up here. The GH6 features a slightly revised cooling system to the GH5, because of the additional processing needed to achieve what it can do without overheating. Panasonic has stated that the camera will give you truly unlimited recording in every single mode, within obvious power and media restrictions. In the menu, as you can with the S1H, you can control the fan modes. Here you have Auto 1, Auto 2, Fast, Normal, Slow and Off. Slow is only possible when not in the camera's ProRes mode, and Off is only possible when the camera is in its stills mode. Otherwise, you can choose which mode you want the camera to be in for a given scenario, which could be handy in hotter parts of the world. Throughout our time shooting, we didn't run into any issues with overheating, no matter what modes we used. Here are some quick audio captures of the different fan modes. Right, so here we have the GH6. It's currently in its fan off mode. I'm going to type on my keyboard a little bit just so you can hear the kind of sound that the MK600 is picking up. Cool, so now I'm going to go into the menu and go through the different modes. So here we have slow. We have normal. We have fast. Right, now let's talk about the big old elephant in the room, the GH6's autofocus performance. Panasonic has not implemented any new system into this camera. It is using the same DFD contrast-based autofocus system that has been present in their last few camera systems, but of course with the benefit of updated processing power. As you could with previous Panasonic cameras, you can go into the AF custom setting for video mode where you can adjust your speed and sensitivity. Speed from slow to fast and sensitivity from locked on to responsive. You can go in and tweak exactly how you want it to perform depending on the scenario. As with previous Panasonic cameras that use their latest DFD contrast-based system, there are some ways to get a better autofocus performance. The lower the resolution, the better it performs. The less of the sensor you use, the better it performs. The higher the frame rate and shutter speed you use, the better it performs. The more contrast in your scene and in the color profile you are using, the better it performs. I've watched so much content about these systems over the past couple of weeks, so I could really give this system a fair test. There are plenty of videos online comparing the S5 to the rest of Panasonic's older lineup of cameras, showcasing the improvements the S5 had. So instead of comparing the GH6 to older cameras, I think comparing it to the S5 is more worthwhile. We used the same settings across both cameras as closely as we could and used the 20-60 on the S5 and 12-60 on the GH6. They both perform quite similarly, with similar issues translating the awesome subject tracking to smooth, reliable focus. For this kind of scenario, it isn't unusable by any means, it's just not 100% reliable. I would happily use it for talking head setups like this, basic tap focus pulls and general shots. What I wouldn't want to do is set it up at a wedding to capture the bride walking down the aisle, as I just wouldn't trust it. Canon and Sony have set a new gold standard for reliability and flexibility of autofocus systems, and as a result, these systems can most of the time be relied on. while with Panasonic cameras, you really can't yet. Whether this is a big deal or not is down to you and how you shoot. Honestly, the only time we use autofocus is when shooting these pieces to camera, and the rest of the time we are manual focusing, but that's because our productions allow us to do this. So if you require a camera with an autofocus system you need to rely on, then a Panasonic camera isn't for you. If you sometimes autofocus and sometimes manual focus, a Panasonic camera can work. If you only manual focus, then great, you can get an awesome camera at a great price. There have been several cameras over the past 3 years that have done very well, that haven't had reliable autofocus systems, and I think the GH6 will be no different. Panasonic have told me that the introduction of a phase detection system was explored, but the compromises of image quality would have been too great. But I am skeptical on this point, due to the range of cameras that now feature both fantastic image quality and phase detect autofocus systems, such as the Red Komodo and V-Raptor, as well as Canon C300 Mark III and C500 Mark II. I am disappointed Panasonic haven't had a breakthrough with the GH6, because them doing so would have given this camera an even wider user base. I've put a link in the description below to one of Panasonic's LUMIX Academy videos, which breaks down all the different autofocus modes and what to tweak to do what, which is 100% worth understanding to get the most out of this system. If you have any other questions, let us know in the comments. The GH6 has actually seen a decent amount of improvement over the GH5 when it comes to how it handles audio. It features a 3.5mm microphone input on the side and will work with Panasonic's existing DMW XLR1 for people who want more control over their audio, as well as just better mic options and audio quality. When using the XLR1, you can record 4 channels. 2 channels for the 2 XLR ports on the XLR1, and 2 for either the internal mic or the external mic port on the camera. You can also output these 4 channels via HDMI, which could be handy when recording externally. The GH6 features a 3.5mm microphone import that will now allow you to go down to -18 dB, which is 6 dB less than the S5 and the GH5. This is similar to the S1H, and you can even switch the amp to a low mode, which will make it even less hot, which could be very handy. You can now also switch your audio quality between 48kHz 24-bit and 96kHz 24-bit, depending on what you would like to record. The new audio button on the top of the camera is also a really great, fast way to see your audio levels, as well as adjust a range of settings you may need to adjust while shooting. To adjust your levels, all you need to do is just tap on the input you want to adjust, and you can. Here's a quick little audio test to show you the difference between the internal mic, a Sennheiser MK400 pointed directly at me on camera, going into the camera via the 3.5mm input, and then our Sennheiser MK600 boom closer to me, going into the DMW XLR1. The quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog. The quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog. The quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog. The quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog. The quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog. The quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog. The quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog. The quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog. The quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog. The GH6 uses the same battery as the S5, which is the Panasonic DMW BLK22, which is a 2200 mAh battery. This means if you'd like to use an external power source while also using the battery door, you can grab the Panasonic DC coupler from the S5. However, there are plenty of third-party options out there as well, you just won't be able to use the door. When it comes to battery life, Panasonic provided some pretty vague numbers, so we ran some tests ourselves. When shooting ProRes 5.7K 25p, we got roughly an hour and 10 minutes from a fully charged battery. The GH6 now features a USB-C 3.2 port that is capable of being used for power, control, and data. When it comes to powering via the USB-C port, you can charge the battery via this input when the camera is powered off. When doing so with the camera on, it will power the camera and not charge the battery. You will need to have a battery with some charge in it for the camera to boot up, to then be powered via the USB-C input. The camera requires 9 volts, 3 amps, 27 watts to power, and this means that there are plenty of options out on the market that will do this. I've put a link to a few power banks and power supplies in the description. This can be a really great way of shooting if you want to run the camera for long periods of time via mains or via a large battery bank. However, of course, you can always just rig the camera up with more conventional cinema batteries like V-Locks and gold mount batteries. You will also be able to tether directly to a PC or Mac using this USB port. This could be for stills or video, as the GH6, like previous Panasonic cameras, can be used with their webcam utility to stream directly to a range of platforms, as well as be used as a webcam for a range of software applications. This could be handy if you are planning to use the camera to live stream and do not want to use some kind of HDMI converter or switcher. I've put a link down in the description if you want more info about this. In a future firmware update, the GH6 will be able to record directly to USB-C SSDs, which is a feature people have been asking Panasonic to add for a while now, and it's awesome that they have listened. We don't have any more details on this yet, but make sure to follow us on our social media channels to learn more when we do. The GH6 can be used with Panasonic's LUMIX Sync app, which is available on iOS or Android. It allows you to do a range of things, and most importantly for video shooters, monitor your image, control the camera, and trigger the camera. The image quality will really depend on your connection, but it's great to have an app that can be used for monitoring and triggering in case your camera is in a place where you can't trigger it by hand. It's a pretty simple app, but you can control all of the key functions you may need to, including focus, which is pretty handy. Panasonic has done a great breakdown of the app and how to get it all set up, so instead of me going through it here, I've put a link to it in the description. Physically, the GH6 is like a mix of the GH5 Mark II and S1H. It's taken on the more angular design of the newer Panasonic cameras over the more rounded edges the original GH5 had. In the hand, the camera feels much more substantial than previous MFT cameras from Panasonic. It definitely looks and feels bigger, even when compared to the S5, A7 IV and R6. Weight-wise, it is roughly 823 grams, which is roughly 100 grams heavier than the GH5, which is impressive given its size increase. On the front of the camera, we have a couple of function buttons, the flash sync port, which doubles as the timecode in and out port when used with the included converter cable, and a new record button to the left of the mount. You also have a new tally light, which will be really handy. On the top, you have your drive mode dial on the left, Panasonic's standard hot shoe, a locking mode dial, and a pretty familiar looking set of buttons and dials. The two new additions here though are the bright red record button, as well as a new audio info button, which when pressed, brings up some key information relating to the audio you are capturing, which will be handy when recording video. On the bottom, you have the battery door, as well as a slightly updated mounting point on the bottom. Here we have a 1/4" thread accompanied by a locating hole, the same as the S1H. This is great to see as it means any tripod plates that have this, which lots do, you can use the camera without a cage without the chances of it spinning about. On the left of the camera, you have the camera's main I/O. On the right, you have the door for the card slots. On the back, you have a familiar set of buttons and dials, which are pretty similar to most other modern Panasonic mirrorless cameras. However, the layout has changed over the original GH5 and GH5 Mark II to a much better one in my mind. The screen has also improved. It features the same articulating tilty back screen as the S1H, which means you get the best of both worlds. The OLED viewfinder from the last few Panasonic mirrorless cameras has also made its way onto the GH6, which is great. The operating system that the camera is using fits in line with the other ones used in Panasonic's other modern mirrorless cameras. This means that it's just as fully featured for video acquisition as Panasonic's most recent mirrorless cameras, and has seen some improvements over the original GH5 when it was released. Panasonic always offers fantastic video shooting features and functions at their price point, especially when compared to its hybrid competition. I don't want to go in depth with the menu system here, so here are some quick fire features that are great to see in the camera before we get into what's new specifically with the GH6. You have the VariCam or EVA style operation menu, refined Q menu, synchro scan, ability to use shutter angle and gain, good focus peaking, self timer for video, segmented file recording if you are worried about clip corruption, Vlog and HLG, view assist and LUTs. Your zebras go down to the percents needed for 18% grey exposure, waveform, vector scopes, and there's definitely more that I am probably forgetting. I'll put a link to the manual so you can have a dig when it's available in the description. A new feature that has been added is a new safety zone marker. This will be handy when the camera is being used to capture footage for broadcast. In the menu, you can change between a solid outline as well as just a corner indicator and change the size of it between 80, 90 and 95%. The GH6 also now supports up to 20 digits cine-style clip naming from MOV clips, and this is the same naming structure that is possible on the VariCam series. With Panasonic's previous S and GH series cameras, when you wanted to load your own LUTs in, they needed to be VLT format, which meant you had to convert your 3D or cube LUTs to VLT using a piece of software like Resolve or LUTCalc. However, with the GH6, you can now use cube, which is great as it's a much more used format than VLT. Otherwise, getting the LUTs onto the GH6 is the same process as before, apart from it now seems like the names of the LUTs can be longer than 3 letters, which is also nice as you can be more descriptive of your names. One thing that we noticed was that there is a small delay between hitting the record button and recording. This wouldn't be an issue apart from the weird time delay between the red frame and record button showing on your monitor, and then the time you've been recording popping up next. The moment 0 seconds appears is the moment the camera begins recording, and from our testing, there is a roughly 1 second difference between the red record symbol and the timer appearing. It's probably a small and pretty insignificant detail for most, but something we noticed when doing voice slates for our noise tests, and we thought some people may want to be aware of it. Another thing worth noting if you're an existing MFT user that is coming over to the GH6 is that your Panasonic lenses may need to be updated to new firmware that Panasonic will be releasing if you want to use them at higher frame rates with the camera. For more information on this, I would suggest heading over to Panasonic's site and seeing if new firmware is available for your lens. One feature that I am disappointed to not see implemented in the camera by Panasonic is false color. It's really the main exposure tool that they are missing now, and considering this camera is definitely more aimed at video than stills, it's a shame that it's not in here. Let's quickly go over some of the key accessories that the GH6 has and needs. Due to the increased size and changes in physical design, accessories designed for the GH5 like cages will most likely not work with the GH6. However, I'm sure every normal rigging manufacturer will be releasing theirs as soon as they can. And we've actually got the Zacuto one here with us early. There are plenty of awesome MFT lenses that could be great if you want the best autofocus performance possible, or for them to be compact and light. However, a very popular solution with MFT cameras is to use a speed booster and lenses designed for larger format sensors. The classic combination of the XL from Metabones and the Sigma 18-35 is a killer pairing with these cameras. But yeah, the sky's the limit when it comes to lenses. We've put a range of our recommended accessories on our GH6 webpage, so if you want to see that, link to that is in the description. So after all of this, I really hope you understand whether this is the camera for you or not. I think the GH6 definitely has its place in the market, and Panasonic have always done a fantastic job at making their cameras great to shoot with for video creators. And you can see that from the feedback you guys gave on our YouTube post asking about what you thought about Micro Four Thirds. Thank you so much everyone who commented, by the way. However, after all of the delays and promises, I was honestly expecting a little bit more. I will never understand Panasonic's stubbornness to not implement a modern autofocus system into their cameras. And if this is something that matters to you, then Canon or Sony will be a far better option. However, what people gloss over when making these complaints is that the perfect camera doesn't exist, and especially at this price point. When we compare the GH6 to the A7 IV and R6, the GH6 has better stabilization, better battery life, truly unlimited recording, better internal codec options and frame rates, and more video-orientated features than both of those cameras. So whether the benefits of a full-frame sensor and a much better autofocus system outweigh the cons of these cameras over the GH6 is completely up to you. I just feel that if Panasonic had managed to implement a more mature autofocus system into this camera at the price it is, they would have absolutely dominated the sub £3,000 market when it comes to shooting video. The second class of camera that we can compare the GH6 to is the more cinema-orientated ones, such as the Blackmagic Pocket 4K, 6K and 6K Pro, and Zcam's E2 M4. Honestly, it features some stiff competition here, mainly from Blackmagic. The 4K and 6K Pro offer impressive value for money. We looked at the 6K Pro last year and absolutely loved it for the price. Image is pretty subjective, but the 6K Pro does edge it out when it comes to dynamic range. The main benefit the GH6 has is its better ergonomics and form factor, better weather sealing, a great included EVF, a more comprehensive menu system which honestly is a pro and a con, great in-camera stabilization, good lens adaptability, more usable autofocus and better battery life. The 6K Pro does have better inputs and outputs on the body, internal NDs, Blackmagic's fantastic B-roll internally, and a 1000 nit screen on the back as well. The Pocket 4K is almost half the price, and while the battery life makes it unusable for some people, it's still the best option for filmmakers at this £1,000 price point. The last comparison is Panasonic's lineup. They have a large range of mirrorless cameras in their lineup now, which means that the GH6 can easily be compared to their existing set of cameras. The S5 is one of Panasonic's newest cameras, and when we looked at it when it was released, we really liked it. It just lacks the more robust formats and codecs that the GH6 has. They are both incredibly similar, where the differences mainly lie are the internal recording formats and frame rates, as well as the sensor design and everything that comes with that, aka the S5 has better low light and dynamic range. But the GH6 does offer a great package for its price when compared to the rest of their lineup. Choosing a camera and the accessories around it can be really difficult, so if you have any questions you can let me know down in the comments below and I'll get back to you. And if you're in the UK or Europe and want some more detailed advice, give us a call via the details in the description below. Let us know if you have any more questions or what you think of the GH6 in the comments below. And if you like the video, please give it a like and maybe even consider subscribing so you don't miss out on our awesome upcoming content. And thank you so much for watching.